Hello biology students, this is the third and final video reviewing Module 15, which will cover pages 482 to 490. And we're starting off this section with the concept of pollination, which is the transfer of pollen grains from the anther on a flower to the carpel, and it's necessary for the flower to form seeds. So the plant attracts insects and birds in different ways, which helps to facilitate pollination. And one of the things that attracts insects and birds is nectar. Nectar is a sweet solution that the plant produces, and it attracts insects like bees, moths, and butterflies, and birds to the plants out of the flowers. And then when these insects or birds travel from flower to flower, it will bring pollen from one flower to another, allowing it to pollinate them. Going into a little more detail here, birds like hummingbirds are typically attracted to certain types of red flowers, which store nectar in long tubes. The flowers do not have a strong smell, and the birds can't smell. However, it seems to be the color and shape of the flower that would attract those types of birds. And then, interestingly, insects are not attracted to these types of flowers. And even when designing artificial hummingbird feeders, you may often notice that they use red as a color for that. Now, the variety of flowers that attract bees usually will have a sweet smell. And interestingly, the bees then will sometimes or often carry pollen back to their hive in sacs on their legs called pollen sacs. And then this pollen is combined with nectar back at the hive to form a nutrient called bee bread for the larvae. Beetles are another means of pollination. They are attracted interestingly, by the smell of dung and decaying matter. And so some flowers have an odor that's similar to that type of matter and attract beetles. Then when the beetles visit the flowers and visit different flowers, then they can transmit the pollen from one flower to another. And so that's just one more way that pollination can occur. So then we have moths and butterflies. Butterflies, as we know, are active during the day. They seem to be attracted to flowers with fragrant smells and flowers with a flat surface, like a daisy, or this is like a black-eyed Susan. Whereas moths are active at night, and they're attracted also to fragrant smells, but particularly to pale colors, maybe because they look brighter at night, I'm not sure. But both of these butterflies and moths aid in pollination by their visits to various flowers. So on your own, 15-14, suppose you were blindfolded and asked to smell several flowers. If you encountered a flower with little or no smell, what would be a good guess as to its predominant color? So thinking back on the hummingbirds, we would say if a flower has no smell, it is more likely to be red than another color. All right, 15-15. Suppose you were on an island with plenty of plant life, but essentially no insects or birds. What would you expect? Would you expect to see many flowering plants? Why or why not? So the answer would be no. You would expect to see few flowering plants because birds and insects are vital to pollination of flowering plants. And incidentally, there is a worldwide concern because the population of bees has been plummeting, and people are trying to investigate why that is. All right, so let's look at the concept of fertilization on page 484. You can follow along with figure 15.9 in your book if you choose to. And here we have the carpel, right, of the flower. and the pollination starts with the attachment of the pollen grains to the stigma, that's the top of the carpel, and it also often has like a sticky substance. So the pollen grains first are delivered to the stigma, and then remember the pollen grains are made of two parts. It has the pollen tube and the sperm in it. So it's the pollen tube, which is represented by this black dot, that sort of does the work of creating a pathway down the style and then down into the ovary here, and obviously eventually breaking into an embryo sac. So just to review here, a pollen tube is formed from the tube nucleus, which finds its way to the embryo sac, and then the sperm follow down that tube. If the pollen grain only had one sperm, it will divide and create two. However, some of the pollen grains already have two sperm, and so then they would be all set. Once the tube nucleus bursts into the embryo sac, then the sperm follow, and that initiates fertilization. Okay, so remember we had the two sperm. So one of the sperm cells fuses with one of, remember these 6 small cells here that were formed in the embryo sac? Well, one of the sperm fuses with one of those small ones, and that will form the zygote. So that's the basically the part of the plant that's going to grow into an embryo. Then the other sperm cell, remember there were 2, travels to this double nuclei cell, the one that was gray here, in the center of the ovule, and fuses, and that part results in what's called the endosperm. And remember, because this had 2 nuclei, it has sort of an extra genetic information, and this will develop into a food source for the zygote. And so the reason it's called double fertilization is that it requires 2 sperm to fuse with the cells. And then ultimately, the seed, which we'll see down the road, will be a package of the zygote and the endosperm as they mature through, as they continue to mature. All right, so let's look at On Your Own, page 485, 1516. It says in Module 7, we use the letter N, so it's a lowercase n, to represent haploid cells, and 2N to represent diploid cells. Using this notation, how would you represent the zygote and the endosperm? So these were sort of interesting. The zygote is produced by 2 haploid cells, so that would be considered 2N. But the endosperm, remember, was produced by 3 haploid cells. It was the one sperm and then fertilizing those 2 haploid nuclei, so it's actually considered a 3N. Okay, so On Your Own, page 485, the process of a seedling sprouting from a seed is also often called germination. So that's one interpretation of germination. One of the steps in the fertilization process described above is often called germination as well. So when they're saying above, they mean like in this just previous part of the chapter. What part of the fertilization process discussed could be called germination? So the answer to that would just be the formation of that pollen tube is also sometimes called germination, but it's a little bit confusing because they're definitely different parts of the process. All right, so let's look at formation of seeds. So after that fertilization, then the cotyledon form, and so we know in monocots, the mono being one cotyledon is formed. So an example of that is corn, and in dicots we have 2 cotyledon being formed, And that example of that is the beans. So below, in this figure that you have here, right, this is the inside of a corn seed. That's the monocot. And this is the one on the right is the dicot, the bean seed. So just to compare and to contrast them a little bit, in the monocot here, you can see the cotyledon is here, and then this portion is considered the endosperm. And this it provides nutrients to the embryo with the help of this cotyledon, because the cotyledon produces enzymes that break down the endosperm and provides nutrients to the embryo. The dicot on the right here is a little different, right, because you don't have the endosperm present here anymore. It was already absorbed by these two cotyledons, and the two cotyledons are actually what directly provide food to the embryo. So that's just a little comparison of the monocot versus dicot. Then we know once a seed is mature, the embryo does not require any more food because it stops developing. The plant severs its connection with the ovule and forms a protective coating on the outside of it called a testa. And then once the testa is truly matured, then it's called a seed. So that's the formation of a seed. All right, so let's compare a little bit between like the concept of a seed versus a fruit. So a seed that we just looked at is an ovule with a protective coating that encases a mature plant embryo and a nutrient source. Okay, so this might be an example of a seed. Versus a fruit, which is a mature ovary, so that the whole entire fruit is actually considered the ovary, and that has a seed or multiple seeds inside of it. So fruits have a huge variety of possibilities, right? We have both simple fruits and compound fruits. So a simple fruit is a fruit just formed from one ovary, and they can be broken down in two categories. A fleshy fruit, it has a fleshy tissue that forms between the seeds and the ovary covering, and that would include apples, tomatoes, cucumbers, and cantaloupe. And as opposed to a dry fruit, which has no fleshy tissue, and those include nuts, grains, and pods. Now that's compared to compound fruits, which might be found in aggregate or multiple forms. A compound fruit is formed from many ovaries, and in the aggregate form, several ovaries from the same flower form the fruit, like in the concept of raspberries and strawberries. However, in multiple fruit, this is considered a collection of ovaries that comes from different flowers to form fruits like pineapples, figs, and mulberries. So, like I said, there's quite a variety, and that's one way to classify fruits. So, here's some example of simple fleshy fruits. You have the pomes, which include apples and pears. And here the fleshy part of the fruit is not formed from the ovary, but interesting, comes from the pedicel. Remember, like the base of the flower. Then you have drupes, which are olives and peaches. The seeds encased in the covering and is called the pit of the drupe. Then we go to berries, which would include tomatoes and grapes. Here the ovary has a thin covering around a fleshy tissue. And then we have things like modified berries, which includes cucumbers and oranges. And here the ovary has a thick, tough covering. So it's kind of interesting because you wouldn't really think of a cucumber as a berry, but that's the fruit family it falls in. Okay, so let's look at some dry fruits. You have pods, which include beans and peanuts. Here the ovary has a single chamber containing many seeds. And just to point out, peanuts are not actually nuts. They grow underground, and they're considered legumes, which are seeds enclosed in pods. So hence it's a pod. All right, then we have a capsule. It'd be like here, poppy seeds. The ovary has many chambers here, and each chamber has many seeds. Then you have the samara. The fruit forms a long, thin wing from the ovary wall, as seen in the maple tree. Then you have nuts. The ovary forms a hard, woody covering around a single seed, and that includes walnuts and acorns. Then you have the grain. Here, the ovary is connected to the seed, and you could think of corn as an example. And then the achene, the ovary is separated from the seed, and here an example of that is the sunflower. Okay, let's look at on your own 1518. The mature bean seed shown on figure 1510 is here, has no endosperm. Did it ever have one? If so, what happened to it? So we talked about this a little bit previously, but we know the seed did have an endosperm, but it was absorbed by these cotyledons while the seed matured. All right, so let's finally look at germination. Germination occurs underground when a seed initially is warm, so this is a great time of year to think about germination as the soil warms up. Then that testa, that covering on the outside of the seed, loosens, which allows water to get inside the seed, and it triggers growth, or what we call germination. So the first part that emerges, right, is called the radicle. It's the lower portion of the embryo, sprouts out of the seed, and that will eventually develop into the roots of the plant. And so you can see that here and here developing into the roots. Then the hypocotyl, which is here, the middle portion of the embryo, forms the stem. So that's here and here. And then all the food at this point is provided by the cotyledons, and no photosynthesis is taking place. Then, as the plant emerges and develops, what's called the epicotyl emerges at the top of the plant. That's the region above the cotyledons, and that's where the first true leaves emerge. So, just to review a few things, a seedling is formed when the plant breaks through the soil. The cotyledons break open and they form sort of these leaf-like structures. They're not considered true leaves, but they're called seed leaves. So on this figure, that's an example of those there. The top part of the embryo above the cotyledon is called the epicotyl. That's where the true leaves form. And then if an embryo forms seeds in the before it emerges through the soil, it's called a plumule. So a plumule is formed if the embryo forms the beginning of its true leaves while it's still in the seed. All right, on your own, 1519. If you plant a seed too deep, the seedling will break through the seed and begin to grow. It will die before it reaches the surface. However, why does the plant die? Well, that is because it more or less dies of starvation, because the endosperm has some nutrients to allow the embryo to start growing. Once it gets to the surface, the plant relies on photosynthesis. But if it's buried too deep in the soil, then it may not have enough of the nutrients from the endosperm to make it through the soil, and so it would die. Okay, so that is the end of the module. Just giving you a heads up that there will be some lab work but I will talk about that later, and we'll go over some sort of modified version of the experiments in the lab on flower anatomy and fruit classification.